All right, what's up guys? So we're at exercise number 2. First exercise of the video series here in the workout was on the other side of the gym. It was your seated leg curl. We talked about that in review of being an opportunity for you to train your hamstrings through knee flexion, knee flexing in a lengthened position. So kind of this fully hip flex position and exercising that. We also talked about how that's a really powerful position for the hamstrings and possibly the calves. And I gave you a couple of points of how to overcome that to make sure that everything was staying in the hamstrings. I can't emphasize enough that for me, for hamstring development, that if you can master that exercise, that's going to take your hamstrings a really long way. However, it's important to train them in other forms of their muscle length. And if we're working knee flexion in the fully lengthened position in the seated leg curl, why not train them in the opposite? Why not train knee flexion in a fully contracted range for the hamstring? Well, that's why we're here at the lying leg curl. Now, you could start with this in your workout if you're super weak in the short position. However, since every muscle is really weak in that spot, neurologically really weak in that spot, there is a point of diminishing returns where if the load is challenging enough and your effort is high enough, your body's just not going to be able to do it over and over. It's kind of like a sprint. How many times do you think you could, at full bore, do a 100-meter dash without your time actually absolutely just falling off the side of a cliff? Probably not many. So compare that to your lying leg curl. It's going to be similar to that. That's kind of why I put it second. It's not my main emphasis, but I would like to get one really good set out of it and then sustain that hopefully over the course of the next couple sets. Now, you could do that where if you're doing like full output sets, or you could do it kind of like the program is right now, where you're doing 5 reps that are, let's say at like 80-85% capacity, and trying to make sure that that is sustained over the course of the 3 total sets. Okay, so that's an option as well. Now, without going off track too much, let's actually talk about the exercise. So we were working hamstrings here. Now we're working hamstrings more here. Okay, so hip extended and knee flexion. That is a fully shortened hamstring. Okay, now realize that the machine that you get on is going to dictate that a little bit. I've seen some machines that are pitched very deeply in this bend. Okay, I've seen some machines that are more flat, and I've seen some that have some like steps going on and stuff like that. That's going to dictate what happens at your pelvis. You need to make the decision on what pelvic angle you want to be in and just maintain that. Just realize what that's doing from a function standpoint and an anatomy standpoint for those hamstrings, if that's what we're trying to target, okay? So if we are in more of this hip extended position and working here, we could argue that is my fully contracted hamstring, okay? If I bend at the waist a little more, okay, that is less of a contracted position. That is less of a contracted position. That is less of a contracted position. In fact, that's close to my seated leg curl, all right? So you can see how the orientation of what happens at those hips changes the actual muscle length of that hamstring, okay? So if you are trying to train your hamstring as close as possible to that short position, you need to make sure that your hip is as extended as possible. If you have a hard time sustaining performance in that fully shortened position, one way to change it mechanically or extend the set mechanically is if I'm in this fully extended position, I just stick my bum out a little bit or my butt out a little bit, and that's less of a hip extended position. Stick it out a little more. It's less of a hip extended position. So I can train in what's close to a fully shortened position by changing the orientation of how extended that hip is. Hopefully that makes sense, okay? Outside of being like super technical with the mechanics of what's happening with your hamstrings, realize that the main why we are here is to get better at contracting our hamstrings in their fully shortened position. And in addition to that, being able to progress that resistance in that short position effectively without launching, which leads me into my next point. Okay, so you have this foot pad, and the same carryover from video 1 with the seated leg curl is this foot pad should not slide at any point in time. So it needs to be on the back of your calf or your Achilles tendon, and it shouldn't move. It should stay in that spot. If it rolls, you need to make an adjustment, okay? It's really easy since your hamstrings are weak in this range of motion. They're far weaker in this range than they were in the seated leg curl. And coming from the seated leg curl, they're pre-exhausted a little bit, okay? It's easy for your calves to launch this back, to to get this thing floating. It's absolutely the last thing that I want you to do. So from maybe a teaching standpoint, I can make the argument that I'm going to actually bend my knees enough and get this pad to a point where I feel like my hamstring is taking like most of the load, 99.9% of the load. If I actually get in here and sit and set, okay, I'm gonna kind of bend until I feel right there is about where my hamstrings have all of the load in them. I can feel like they have 100% tension, or what I would perceive as 100% tension, okay? If I go out to here, I feel like it's just my knees, kind of my calves. My hamstrings definitely feel something, but I kind of have to launch to get them started. All right, so I would advise from a teaching standpoint, until you become good at this exercise, to get it up out of that full knee extended position. Is that bad? You can make the argument that it's not 100% healthy, okay, but we're talking about stimulating tissue. We're trying to stimulate only our hamstrings here. We need to put them through a contractile range where they're doing the majority of the work, and that may require you being here, okay? Another thing is your stability, less stability here, okay? So a couple things. To provide a little stability around the pelvis, I advise you cinching or tensing your pelvis a little bit with your glutes, okay? It doesn't mean like contracting them as hard as you can. It just means kind of going, okay, like I can feel them. They're kind of working there. I have an awareness of them, and once you have that awareness of them, then you've earned the right to actually go through the knee flexing action of the exercise. But while you go through your repetitions, you can't let go of your pelvis. Those glutes have to stay tight, because the biggest thing that I see is people get in a hamstring curl. Say like I'm in the lion leg curl here, I see this extending going on here, or flexing the lower lumbar. Okay, I see this extra movement happening at the torso. Well, guess what, guys? My hamstring's attached to my pelvis. They don't attach to my torso. So since I didn't add stability to my pelvis, my upper body's trying to make up for that lack of stability, all right? So provide stability there. Second opportunity you have is this unmovable pad that I'm sitting on. So if I take my thigh and make as much contact into that pad as I possibly can, and drive all that surface area into that pad at a 10 out of 10 the entire time, I'm creating an opposing force that's giving stability for those hamstrings to get output. Follow me there, okay? An opposing force, an immovable object that I'm driving into so that the opposite muscle group can actually work. Pretty simple, right? People usually just, they crap the bed with that, okay? So make sure that you are not one of them. At any point through this knee flexing, if that thigh lifts through the pad, it's not hamstrings anymore. It's glutes or low back or something else taking over, all right? Have to be pushing that pad the entire time. Pelvis can kind of move. It can kind of shift like it naturally should, okay? But it shouldn't be in excess, and it should start with pelvic movement, okay? It should start with hamstring muscle contracting, hamstring muscle lengthening, hamstring muscle contracting, hamstring muscle lengthening. It's pretty simple, guys, okay? To really get movement happening most and first between 2 points, top of my pelvis and at my knee joint, okay? Last thing I want to point out is the obvious. Same thing here. This is a hinge moving, all right? I have a hinge that's moving through space. My body needs to hinge too. So the hinging of my knees, that joint, needs to match with the hinge of the actual machine, okay? If you're not matching up with that, you're setting yourself up for failure like you will on every hinge application you use in the gym. So make sure you start off with the basic, simple stuff. Match up with the hinge, okay? Put your pelvis in a position where your hamstrings feel like they can contract strong. Butt up a little bit, maybe butt down a little bit, maybe butt down even further, to realize the more that butt starts to drop, the shorter position the hamstrings are potentially in, okay? Use the thigh pad. Tense the glutes. Make sure that the foot pad's in a position to where it's not going to roll. And just make sure from there you're working your hamstrings in a contractile range that they're able to keep the majority of the tension. So if you can't extend your knee the entire way, don't go to that position. You get to a point where your thigh comes off that pad, don't go to that position. Keep it on the hamstrings the entire time. Hopefully that video was helpful. We could continue to talk about this. There's more. But for me personally, that's a good foundation of basics that can take you for 99% of your training journey, and you'll be just fine as long as you keep progressing those fundamental things.